afternoon, and thank you all of you for being here today, in spite of all the exciting things going on in this country, all the news falling upon us all the time, to take some time to listen to the Nordic ambassadors. Sweden is today proudly celebrating the 250th anniversary of our Freedom of Information Act in 1766. This was an early expression of the Age of Enlightenment, and it was made possible because of an interregnum between two authoritarian kings, well known in our history. I don't know how well known they are in Japan. Charles XII, who died in 1718, and Gustavus III, who staged a coup in 1772. This was also a period which saw the birth of Swedish party politics, where two opposing parliamentary groupings wanted to avoid the other side gaining an information monopoly. The Act of 1766 was made part of the Constitution, and this status conferred to it the dignity of an inalienable right. Needless to say, freedom of expression passed through many difficult periods. But the unique features of the 1766 Act turned out to be resilient, and they have survived until today. Freedom of publication without censorship. So by censorship, this was of course prior censorship. Any publisher could publish whatever he wanted without any authority looking at it. This is a very interesting item. This is only one person is responsible for the content of the publication. This means that the sources, other auxiliary sources of information, were protected. The third tenet is freedom of expression. And it might sound kind of very general or banal, but what this means is that every person, in whatever position he or she finds himself or herself, is free to hand over information to a publisher. This is very fundamental, a very fundamental part of the Act. And when such a leak, as we say today, has occurred, the Act prohibits an investigation into the source. So the source was and is constitutionally protected. Another unique feature is the basic principle of access to official documents. All documents, all official documents, are available for scrutiny on demand from anyone. And the basic principle shifted from what may be permitted to what is prohibited. Because as we shall see, of course, there will be legislation that limits the access to public documents. And this is how, in the Act itself, the thinking behind these new rules were summarized. Read this through, it's quite interesting. This was written in 1766, giving all the citizens a better opportunity to know and to evaluate the wisdom of government. A freedom regarded as one of the best means to improve customs and respect for the law, as abuse and illegality can become more apparent to the public. And I would claim that this is a fundamental act that has since been applied as a basic principle for democracies and for countries that apply the rule of law. and the control of government. This is maybe a little bit more tedious, but still, there is the way it's all regulated now, because we shouldn't spend all my 10 minutes talking about 1766. But the Basic Act is still there, although in its post-war version, 1949. But all the basic elements from 1766 are still around. And we added a very important constitutional law in 1991, the Freedom of Expression Act, that is basically simply transposing or transferring the rules of the Information Act to the spoken or visual media. This is a fundamentally important law, although it's not a part of the Constitution. It is the Act on Public Access to Information and Secrecy. This Act stipulates in great detail and sector by sector the conditions for classifying documents. This means all documents are publicly accessible unless covered by specific stipulations in this law. It also includes, and this is a truly unique aspect, and again, sector by sector, when the secrecy regulations overrule the constitutionally protected right to free speech. Let me give you just one example to illustrate this. Concerning classified documents on finance, monetary or exchange rate policies, such documents emanating from the central bank overrule the whistleblowing right. But all others in this area, the right of freedom of expression prevails. And then, of course, in ordinary criminal law, general restrictions on free speech are regulated, such as treason, libel, defamation, and what is in Japan known as hate speech. Winning legal battles on such grounds are intentionally extremely difficult. But some amendments in 2014 were aimed at rebalancing this slightly against the background of increasing verbal abuse on the internet. You may be interested as journalists in the self-regulated regime that has been instituted by the Swedish media themselves. It's totally voluntary, and it began in 1916. It's quite interesting. In 1916, towards the end of the First World War, following biased reporting from the war. That is, certain publications were biased in favor of one or other of the belligerents, and this was felt to be an unhealthy situation. And then, of course, sensationalism and invasion of privacy have been issues all along. And in fact, at some point, I think in the 60s, the government considered some kind of legal regulation to counter abuse. And the response from media was clear. Ethical rules were refined, and in 1969, the press itself appointed an ombudsman to whom the public can file complaints. Fines and compulsory publication of judgments can be awarded. I think you will not be surprised to see the kind of ethical principles that our media has sort of committed to abide by. This is discussed, I guess, in Japan every day, and certainly in Sweden every day, how the media actually live up to these things. But I think the self-regulatory principle is an extremely important one. Let me just briefly end by pointing out the issues that we can identify today, and they're, of course, by no means only Swedish ones. Survival of independent journalism. And in this case, I mean survival of independent journalism in democracies. Not talking about countries where freedom of speech is actually being suppressed. But the technological evolution made, of course, the consumption of news an entirely different proposition. I would claim that Japan is resisting rather well, comparatively speaking. Japanese people love their newspaper, reading it every day, and so the issue there is, I mean, journalism, the media survive, they're actually doing quite well, whereas in our country, economically speaking, they struggle. And there is a great risk of fragmentation of news. This, I already touched on it very briefly. The personal integrity is clearly an issue in the internet era, but I feel we are faced with this very dangerous temptation of regulating the internet, and that could be the beginning of the end of press freedom or the freedom of speech. And of course, the obvious situation where, in fact, the Nordic countries and Japan, in their respective regions, find themselves as outposts of free speech. Maybe we don't think about this every day, but we have neighbors in both our regions where freedom of the press, freedom of the media, and freedom of speech is not guaranteed. And I believe that this is a kind of mission that countries as ourselves share, and we must work together. And these are just some of the sad facts and statistics about the situation of, particularly of journalists, and the vulnerability of journalists around the world. Thank you so much.